Words are bridges.
शब्द सेतु हैं।
अल्फाज दिलों को और इंसानियत को जोड़ने का एक अजीम और तरीन पुल है।
വാക്കുകൾ പാലങ്ങളാണ്.
लफ्ज़ सगरी कदलदारान
वहीनतुन
आखर हमार मेल संग आखर हमार जोड़
শব্দই সমন্বয়ৰ হেতু
Cocktail rock, yakraise.
Thuhi inkung kaina siam tu ani.
Ajrahana apati kisale.
ग्राउथाइनिंग याउक्राई
शब्द सेतु होन.
शब्दां दी सान।
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of our festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and festival producer Sonjoy Roy and all of us at Teamwork Arts, I welcome you back for another episode of Jaipur Literature Festival's Words Are Bridges. Our session today is Poetry in Hidden Places. Ulrich Sandig and Karen Leader in conversation with Anjum Katyal. Ulrich Sandig's latest novel of poetry is an integration of the dark undertones of the fairy tales by the Grimm brothers with contemporary issues of migration, war, and ecological threat. Translated from German to English by Karen Leader, the poets present a sharp reminder of the importance of empathy and what it means to be human. Together with Anjum Katyal, they discuss the writing process, the art of translations, and the constant search for poetry in hidden places. Ulrich Sandig has written 2 books of short stories and 4 volumes of poetry, as well as a novel, Monsters Like Us, which appeared this year. She often works with filmmakers, sound artists, and musicians, and her CD with poetry band Landschaft appeared in 2018. Sandig has won many prizes, including most recently the Wilhelm Lehman Prize and the Horst Bingle Prize. Karen Leader is a writer, critic, and prize-winning translator of German literature, including works by Ders Grunbein, Volker Braun, Michael Kruger, Evelyn Schlack, and Raoul Schrott. Her translation of Ulrich Sandig's Thick of It won an English PEN Award and an American Penheim Award and was runner-up for the Schlegel-Teig Prize. Anjum Katyal is a writer, editor, and translator. She has been chief editor Seagull Books as well as editor Seagull Theatre Quarterly Calcutta and web editor Sarigama HMV. She is the author of several books on theatre and performance and has translated works by Habib Tanveer, Mahashweta Devi, and Meera Mukherjee. She was director APJ Kolkata Literary Festival and curator Nabana Earth Weekend Festival of Arts and Ideas. She also writes poetry and sings the blues. Before we move on to our next session, we'd request you all to please follow us on our handles GLF Litfest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel Jaipur Litfest JLF and our Facebook page JLF Litfest. We now present Poetry in Hidden Places. Ulrich Sandig and Karen Leader in conversation with Anjum Katyal.
Welcome everybody and thank you for that wonderful introduction. This is an evening which is dedicated to discussing the exciting work of Ulrika, and I deliberately say work because she crosses so many different kinds of genres in her creative output. She's a poet, she's written prose, she's a musician, she's had radio programs out, she's had YouTube videos out. So there's a lot of crossings that happen in the course of Ulrika's work, and that's going to be very exciting today to discuss with her translator Karen. And Karen has been actually working quite closely with Ulrika now for more than 1 volume of work. So it's always lovely to be able to talk to 2 people who actually have a relationship that's built over time, especially when it comes to translation. So that's, I think, going to be a very valuable input in today's conversation about translating, which is about bridges and about crossings and about, you know, making connections and recognizing differences. So having said that, I'd like to plunge straight in by asking Ulrika and Karen about the beginning of your work together. I read somewhere, Karen, that you wrote how there was a kind of visceral excitement to watching Ulrika's work, which actually made you want to translate her. And I always feel that starting from a position of desire and passion for the work is a wonderful way of starting to translate, especially when you're working with poetry. So Ulrika and Karen both, would you like to talk about how you began and what was the excitement of discovering each other as writer and translator?
Yeah, first of all, let me just tell you that I'm delighted to have this wonderful session from 3 angles of the world. Karen is in Oxford right now in the UK. You are in, I think,
Calcutta.
In Kolkata.
Calcutta, yes.
And I'm in
yes.
Berlin, Germany. So it's incredibly great that we made it here to meet the 3 of us and to meet with all the listeners and with the public who is watching us. So hi to everyone. So I think Karen kind of found me through through an Australian literature magazine entitled Sports, wasn't it, Karen?
Yes, but it's New Zealand magazine.
Ah, yes, New Zealand.
Wow. So that's like geographically at the other end of the world from where both of you are. That's interesting. So tell us about that, Karen.
It's a 4th corner, isn't it? So yes, I was commissioned to New Zealand was the guest country at the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2012, and I was asked to curate a small collection of German poems for this wonderful poetry magazine, New Zealand poetry magazine called Sport. And I started by looking through recent anthologies and collections to see kind of what new poets were developing, and I found about 6, but Ulrika just immediately stood out. I was so excited by her work. It sounded unlike anything else. I think that's really important. It was a kind of new sound, but also it was a sound I personally identified with. I felt that it was very close to something I'd like to sound like in verse. And so after I'd done the work for this and translated 6 poems, I think, or a few poems, I then wrote to her separately and said, please, can I work with you? So yes, we've been working together for nearly a decade.
Right. And Ulrika, what have you found exciting about the relationship between you and this particular translator?
I could tell you such a lot of things, but I'm trying to perhaps say the most important thing is I'm intrigued by the way I keep learning about my own language and my own verses through her translation, and also through yes, we had a lot of interesting talks when she is in the middle of translating a manuscript and she writes. She suddenly asked me in emails or Skype talks, Ulrika, there's one thing about a verse or a phrase I didn't understand. Please explain this very word. Is it meant in high tone? Is it in colloquial tone? And if so, then from which perspective? And this keeps challenging me in an intellectual as well as emotional way, I'd say. And also in the end, Karen's translations are very British in a way. I'm saying that having in mind that the translator I worked before with was an American living in Germany, so I very much felt her Britishness in a way, and also her very own sound on the other hand, and still while being so British and so much Karen Leader, she comes very close to what I actually want to express, and that is that is like, we were talking about angles before, that is like two angles, two dimensions of one poem, which I'm intrigued about. Yeah.
Wow. Karen, do you want to add to that, or can we get into a reading? Maybe you could read something from one of the poems that demonstrates a little bit of what you were talking about.
I mean, to add to it, I think a translator is a first reader. I mean, a critical reader, an intense reader who gets closer to the language than almost anybody else. And so, in a sense, of course, also has to make choices, because many words mean multiple things in another language. Right. So quite often I go to Ulrika and say, well, this could mean this, 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 or this. Which is most important to you? You know, what is the, you know, which image or which sound or which angle is most important to you? And so that she helps me sort of winnow perhaps out of some of those choices. Although, of course, the translation is always ending up with the choices. Well,
I get the impression that Ulrika plays with lots of meanings also. That she packs these portmanteau words and images which unpack into lots of different directions. That comes through in what I've been reading of her work and also what you've written about her work. So that must make it even more interesting and challenging and the playfulness of it for you as a translator, right? Because there are so many levels simultaneously, like music. You know? There are chords being played and they're touching on all different tonalities. So would you like to talk about that a little bit, maybe Ulrika as well? About the multiplicity of the... Yeah.
Ulrika writes, so there are lots of levels to this. Ulrika writes without capital letters, which are a part of a normal grammatical structure in German, that nouns have capital letters beginning them. But she does away with that. And so that creates, if you can imagine, an ambiguity, so that a word that on the page might look like a noun also can suggest a verb, for example. So verb and nouns are broken down. She plays with idioms, but then changes them a little. She has a lot of quotations from nursery rhymes or songs or traditional sources that are hidden very often. They're not made explicit. And so they bring up a resonance, which again is very different in another language. And finally, she very often uses pairs, so that while a sentence sets something up, later there's a kind of pairing, or even maybe another poem pairs with a poem, so that something is set off but immediately taken back. And so I think what I found exciting, to come back to your first question in a way, is that the reader is placed in a sort of radical insecurity, which is both exhilarating and creative. One is on a real voyage of discovery. And there are lots of voyages in Ulrika's poems also. It's exhilarating, but also a bit frightening, because you don't know where you're going to end up. And you're pulled in lots of directions. And so I think that is part of what's happening. It's a kind of high wire act, in a sense, playing with all the possibilities of language and existing in them. And very often I don't understand the poem when I start translating it. Maybe, I think Ulrika has also said she doesn't always understand what she's writing. And so we're both of us on this voyage of discovery.
Where radical misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely.
But maybe you come to understanding through the business.
So Ulrika, would you like to talk a little about this, or would you like to read something? It would be lovely to hear something, actually.
Yeah, perhaps that's the moment to read something.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
People have now understood a lot about how I write, and now I feel like they should listen to my words also. Karen, should I read the beginning of Grimm and then you read the English translation?
That's just what I was thinking. We had the same thought.
Okay. But I'm just reading the beginning of it, right?
Okay.
Okay. Because it's so long, so. Actually, when I read this poem on stage, and there is an English English reading audience, I do like, and I did that in Chennai last year in the literature festival in Chennai. I like to have an English native speaker read the English translation and me singing sort of a chorus line that is based on a central verse of the poem, like as a backing vocal. So I can't do that now.
Right.
So, but I guess I'm just reading until the chorus line and just humming a little bit something for you. But apologize, I'm not a trained singer, I'm just a vocalist. And this poem is entitled Grimm. Wir schrieben uns Nachrichten auf rohen Eiern. Wir hielten unsere Kratzer und Schleifen auf Kalk für glückliche Zeichen. Einander ohne Rücksicht auf Verluste, buchstäblich alles schreiben zu können. Auf rohen Eiern zumal und in schwankenden, hohen Gebäuden, wie gemacht, sich im heiteren Rasen der Erde sacht zu bewegen. Wir schrieben auf rohen Eiern. Je nach Dringlichkeitsfaktor drückten wir ordentlich auf, bis wieder eines kaputt war. Kein Problem, wir hatten ja eine gegen unendlich gehende Menge an rohen Eiern im Kühlschrank. War kein Problem, wir hatten ja eine gegen unendlich gehende Menge an rohen Eiern am Kühlschrank. Karen, your turn.
Should I read the same bit or carry on?
Yeah, or no, just like from the beginning. Would you read from
the same bit? Yeah.
Grim. We wrote each other messages on raw eggs. We viewed the scratches and loops we made on the shell as hopeful signs that, despite what had been lost, we could write literally anything to each other, at least on raw eggs. And in the tall buildings that swayed as if made for shifting softly along with the bright velocity of the earth. We wrote on raw eggs, and according to the degree of urgency, we pressed extra hard till another cracked. Ha! No problemo. We had a well-nigh limitless supply of raw eggs in the fridge. I think there's something to say about that poem to start with, which is, of course, is that Grimm, the title, refers to the Brothers Grimm and their household.
Yeah.
But in German, Grimm also means it's an archaic word for anger, rage.
Okay.
And of course, the word grim does exist in English, but it means something different. And so already there we have a kind of translation issue. Because the obvious cognate, grim, doesn't actually capture that rage, which is so important to Ulrike. And so I had to find ways of moving around that. And in this poem I did, in fact, the last line finishes with the word grim in German, and I ended up putting and rage most grim, which I hope gets something. But I entitled the poem Grimm as in referring to the Brothers Grimm.
Right, yes. With a double M.
Yes.
Yes, right. Yeah. Well, thank you. That was beautiful. And the little bit of singing at the end kind of just lifted the whole poem. I really envy you that you can move from the spoken word into the sung word. It just brings a sort of an extra dimension to the poetry. So thank you. And I was listening to this, I was thinking of the fact that Karen had also mentioned, and that is also clear in this poem, that there's a very strong link in your work between very, very contemporary issues that you're living in the thick of, in a sense, to quote from your last book of poems, but also with the past, with these inherited images, inherited references things that have lived with you for a long time. So I was wondering if you'd like to talk about that and how the past and the present sort of interweave, and as a writer and how as a translator you responded to that.
Yes, well, I guess I was always influenced by oral tradition, at least as much as of literature itself. So as Karen mentioned before, there are lots of quotations of traditional songs or prayers or idioms that I slightly changed, or also Schlager songs, which I allude to, and this is something that that I'd say I've always worked that way, but in the recent years, since 5 or 6 years, I found myself being politicized because of everything that happened around Europe, because of the refugee crisis, mostly. So while I worked on this Rapeseed collection that is now out with an English translation with Seagull Books in Kolkata, I found myself desperately looking for a language to ask questions that I found my own German poetry scene haven't really done, like ask questions that they hadn't really dared asking for some decades already, because the German poetry scenes tends to be not very political at all for certain reasons. And what I did then is, of course, looking back into my own language history and finding the folk tales of the Brothers Grimm in their harshness, in their precise literacy, in their experimental ways of putting things and they were dark enough. Basically, what I want to say is, I guess they were just dark enough to express that darkness that we felt when the refugee crisis started, and we found ourselves in the middle of the European Union, which makes refugees die in the Mediterranean. And that helped, and I guess the Brothers Grimm and also some other 20th century poets who I never met, but who I read a lot, like Helga Novak, helped me to become harsher and more outspoken, I'd say.
So listening to you talking about how you went back and found a lot of, shall I say, inspiration in the older writing and in folk tales and the Grimm, Brothers Grimm stories, I was just thinking that it seems to me that it almost became a kind of a mulch or a language that you weren't using so much as quotations and direct references, but kind of remaking for yourself. Like the reference that Karen made, that you often use references, but you change them slightly, or there'll be idioms or quotes that are hidden in a way that, people, that you, so they're not standing out as quotations and references, but they're woven into the work. Karen, did you find that, do you think that's true? And did you find that particularly, how did you deal with that as a translator?
I think that's true. The full name of this collection is I Am a Field Full of Rapeseed, Give Cover to Deer, and Shine Like 13 Oil Paintings laid one on top of the other. And in the collection is divided into sections, which each have part of that title as their title. The part with the Grimm poems has the title Oil Paintings Laid One on Top of the Other. And so you mentioned mulch, and I thought of a sort of palimpsest, in a sense, in that the writing is on top, layers and layers of writing, and all these the depths of the shadows of language, although here they're very bright, aren't they, shining through. Of course, it's difficult. So when Ulrike uses a snippet of a Grimm fairy tale, although of course they have a wide currency across the world, none of us respond to them in the way that Germans do, who are all, read them every night when they're growing up. Actually, I read my daughter them as well, so they are currency in our house. But of course, a translation doesn't carry that resonance, and so I use some notes in the collection to readers whereas German readers would hear something already. I think other readers just need that pointing out, and then they can go and find out about them if they want to, but they don't need to. And of course, idioms, yes, but idioms aren't the same in all languages, and so find a new game to play sometimes. Ulrike and I have talked about another poem in this collection, which is based on the beatbox in German, which is Pizzakatze, which is the sound you make when you're beatboxing. But in British English, you have a different thing: boots and kits, boots and cats. And so one poem which evolved around a cat going to eat a pizza had in English to become something about boots, inevitably. And so, but I hope eventually comes back to something that plays the same games. And so, yes, as a translator, one has to try and hear what's going on and find a way of recreating it, or in that mulch that you talked about, making it grow in a different way.
Yeah. So, do you think, Ulrike, you'd like to read something?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to read a poem from the Grimm cycle again, and this poem is entitled Hans and Luck. I don't know how well known the Hans and Luck folktale is in India. I think some might remember that from that, because it's a children's story. So it's based, just to explain for the ones who don't know the story. So Hans is a young lad who learned a profession, and now after having been away from home to learn that profession, he's on his way back home. To his mother, who awaits him eagerly. And also she misses him, of course, but she also awaits him because he is to bring a little sack of money back home to her. And while he's on his way home, he loses everything he has, because he exchanges it firstly for a cow, I think, then for a pig, and it gets lesser and lesser and lesser, and in the end he only has a stone, and he drops the stone. Stone drops into a well and is gone. So and he's still happy, because he thinks, oh, now I don't have to carry the stone anymore. So he's naive and happy and very young in a way. I wrote that poem from the perspective of his mother, sending him a WhatsApp message, I guess. And since it's WhatsApp or another messenger app, it's full of abbreviations.
Right.
Hans im Glück, ich schreibe dir nur, dich wissen zu lassen. Fehlt mir nichts. Das ist mein Hand, das ist mein Arm, das ist mein Auge. Schau genau hin. Es ist alles noch da, seit du nicht mehr da bist. Alles ist mind 1x vorhanden. Mein Stirn, mein Hirn, mein Pech. fasse mich neuerdings kurz. Oh, schreibe dir nur im Sprech der pappweißen Taube vorm Haus. Oh, ihrem mechanischen, überall in Gipfeln ist, oh, oh. Oh. Die sprechigste Taube, Glückstadt an der Elbe, die jedem, wirklich jedem ihrer Berichte eins letzte, hoffnungsvolle Silbe anhängt. Eins, Verschwendung. Breche hier ab. Kann mein eigenes Wort kaum verstehen, lauter Abwesenheit. Abgesehen davon fehlt es mir. Ah, nichts. Lieber Hans, wie geht es dir? Wo bist du? Oh, oh, oh.
Thank you. So are we going to hear that in English as well?
We could do, although it might make more sense just to see it as text. But I'm happy to read it. And
so the text is going to be scrolled, I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I remember reading it as text, and you can sense the sense of rhythm on the page with the abbreviations and the breaks and the white spaces. Yeah. So I think that's a good way of doing it. Just letting it breathe on the page, I think. Yeah.
I'd like to add, Anjum, one thing which just came into my mind is that interestingly, this Hans in Luck poem has been brought into Kashmiri by a translation project that was curated by the Max Muller Bhavan a couple of years ago. And this Kashmiri translation got into the mighty hands of the singer and musician Mohammed Munim Nazir, who is the frontman of Alif, a fusion rock band based in Mumbai. He has found a beautiful musical version to this, very emotional, kind of melancholic, whereas my original poem is kind of ironic and funny, and he puts, being from a culture, Kashmiri culture, that is needs to deal a lot with exiled son who can't really see their parents very often. Right. So he decided to put this in a very melancholic way, to put stress on that. And this is also the interesting point about poetry translation, that that once it's brought into another language, it's also, of course, brought into its cultural and political inflictions.
Yeah, thank you for that. So you have your work existing in Hindi and you have it existing in Kashmiri. Any other Indian languages into which your work has been translated?
No, only English, Hindi, and Kashmiri so far. And if music is a language, then music definitely is a language in India, I'd say, then that might be the fourth language.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You mentioned that you had recently felt yourself becoming very politicized. And I read also that you like to think of yourself, you do think of yourself as a political poet. I think Karen also mentioned that. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that, and also whether that's a point of connect with Karen when you're translating, because the poetry is not overtly political in the way that we've often been trained to think of political writing, as very direct, as rather polemic, and it's communicating a message very almost like way. That's a very traditional understanding of political positions. Your poetry is much more complicated and layered than that, and so it would be interesting if you could talk about this particular aspect of it. Whichever one of you wishes to go first.
Yeah, Karen, go for it. That's such a complicated topic, I'd say, mostly also from the German perspective, because I think German poets are are specifically shy when it comes to political writing because of the poets in the 60s and 70s who were very outspokenly political but couldn't change a thing, which was of course disappointing for the scene and also kind of embarrassing also because some of them proved explicitly wrong when I just think about Günter Grass. So that might be a reason that for German poets being a bit hesitant when it comes to political writing, but that has been changing since 2014, since the beginning of the refugee crisis, I'd say. Yeah. So I guess my writing turning to be out to be more political is very typical for my generation and the younger ones, I'd say. Well, Karen, I guess you can add something to that.
I think that's right. But I suppose I'd add that poetry isn't poetry if it's utterly direct. Actually, it becomes propaganda, doesn't it? And we've got examples of propaganda poetry in the past. But I think Ulrike's poems do sometimes mention political truths and political events and political places. But they're also political when they don't mention them. So there's a poem about torture in Abu Ghraib, for example, and other US detainment camps, or there's a poem about the Idomeni refugee camp, for example. So there's a very specific angle. But I think actually the real power of Ulrike's poetry, the political power of Ulrike's poetry, is in questioning the norms through language. And it renders language into a political tool without it being party political or without it being overt. But it shows that how language can be manipulated by various realities. And so Ulrike tests it out and undermines it and shows how it's become caught up in kind of ideologies and shows it how it can be reused to question those ideologies. And she does that in a variety of very imaginative ways. And so I think, for example, in Britain, I don't know about the young poetry scene in India or in the various scenes, which there must be. In Britain, I think we tend to be less political and more ironic. And I think engagement or heartfelt engagement is often not quite understood, and it's looked at as naive. But I think one of the amazing things about Ulrike's engagement is that it's highly sophisticated, but also highly emotional and highly technically in tune. So again, I found that very sympathetic working with the German tradition, whereas I found myself a little bit alienated by the contemporary scene in Britain sometimes.
Okay, that's interesting. I like the point you made about how the language itself becomes a sort of tool of the political thinking by questioning and by playing with it in a certain way. And Ulrike, I was just wondering, is there a lot of do you refer to Brecht in your mind somewhere when you sort of play when you use language in that way, where you set these several layers of distance or you make it ironic? Is Brecht one of the sort of persistent references anymore, or is he sort of like lived out his usefulness as a
Bertolt Brecht?
No, she says, yeah. Sorry, I was looking. Yeah.
You are asking. I had a short. Your voice was a bit crackling here, so I was
asking if Bertolt Brecht was. Yeah, well, I was talking about Bertolt Brecht. If you felt that he was.
Well, it's hard to do. It's hard to leave him. It's hard not to work on him when you write. When you're a German poet that is interested in performance, so you can't really avoid him. and
Right.
I have two souls for him, or one is for him, one is against him, because I think you can't not be influenced by Brecht's dramatic pieces, and as well as by his poems. When I studied, when I was a student of creative writing at the University of Leipzig, I spent a lot of time with his first volume, because I was so amazed by the fact that he even had the tunes and the scales of his, like he put his own poems into music, of course, and in the last part of his Hauspostille, of his first volume of poetry, he had put a couple of pages with the scales of his poems, which came very close to what I actually wanted to do, but wasn't yet able to do.
Right.
So I'm fascinated. I'm still fascinated by that. But of course, he is a man, and as a woman writer in German language, it's hard to you can't really appreciate his work because of all the things you know about the way he lived.
Yes.
And that patriarchic way to deal with your companion artists is a kind of work that I can't really avoid thinking about that when I read his work. So
yeah, isn't it sad that there are so many brilliant men, writers and artists who've been, completely disgusting in their personal lives, and really find it hard to, sometimes I'm like, it's so hard to forgive that. It's like, why did you mess up your brilliant other work, which is so beautiful, by doing this kind of a person in your personal life? But I know exactly what you're talking about, Ulrika. Karen, you're looking very thoughtful. Do you agree with that?
Ulrika knows that I write about Brecht and write about Brecht's poetry as part of my...
That's why I was so hesitant saying it.
I think he's a great poet, and I think there's another conversation to be had about the particular time and what he did and why, and in many cases the women were, very much party to what was going on, and for very good reason, because it was about the struggle. But I think we stretch into very dangerous territory if we want all our poets to be good people.
I know. Yes, that is true. And that goes for men and women.
Yes.
I think. Yeah, but we're running out of time, and I would love to end with another reading. So I was wondering, Ulrika, if you'd like to read something and maybe leave with a last comment by Karen on what you read. I was thinking of Into Nature, as if that's your last poem, right? Would you like to read that, or do you have something else in mind?
Well, when that poem Into Nature would be best listened to Still of Karen's translation, because firstly, because it's an anagram, and it's read best when you can really read it, and when the audience can really read it on the screen. And secondly, also, I put this anagram, I composed a music to this anagram. I put it into a experimental rap song, I'd say, with my band colleague Grigory Semenchuk, who lives in Western Ukraine. And together we formed the poetry band Landschaft, which means landscape in both German and Ukrainian language. And so now what you will hear now is an anagram of the last three lines of Emma McGordon, who is a British performance poet. And the lines go as follows. I need to remember the lines now without the music. My tongue is a needle, and I am true north, telling lies. So, and for those who are not very sure what an anagram is, just to make sure that everyone knows what it is, I took the numbers of letters and characters of these lines, put them as, so these lines form my first line of the poem, and I put the number and type of characters to form new lines of it. So every line consists of the characters of the first line. That's an anagram. Did I put that
wow,
right?
that must have been easy to do, Karen. Yeah,
exactly.
So
Exactly.
shall we?
But shall we hear it and then talk about it?
The tongue is a needle, and I am true north, telling lies. And I am true lies.
The tongue is a needle, and I am true north, telling lies. In der Heimat tollten Rettungshunde als Alge. Oh, ein Ei! Hatte es unterm Hut getragen. Leer in den Lilien oder Lidos, liegende, rinnende Gottesstatue. Holla, reit an! Im Ultragrün der Auen tosten Satelliten, Goldhelme. Hinein in die Natur. Hinein in die Natur. The tongue is a needle, and I am true north, telling lies. The tongue is a needle, oh,
Is a needle.
die Tiere heulten, Moos, lallten, Ex hat uns hier einer angelogen. Lea, du trottest dahin mit ellenlangen, teuren Automaten, heilst Heide, grillst Dioden und hinterher ausgeatmete Kiwi-Insel Atolle. Du, mandeläugige Lea, nennst es Nitrithalle. Tod, ihr Norden, heiter Tod. Hüll die Gaumensegel in Atlantis. This song is a needle, and I am true north, telling lies. Song
The tongue is a needle,
and I am true
north.
north, telling lies.
Well, I mean, this was a real challenge, and at first I thought this can't be translated. But of course, that made me very keen to translate it. This is one of the places where it's wonderful working with someone as generous as Ulrike, because of course, in order to do the same anagram in English, I had to move away from the very strict meaning of what the German said in order to play the same game.
Right.
Although I hope that in the end, I got back to something very close in essence to the original. but it had to go by different means. And you discover all kinds of things. For example, there are 8 E's in each line. And that's why in the English, we don't use E's in the same way, I discover, as in German, because of course, because of the German language of the endings, there are lots of E's at the end. But of course, in English, become words with long E's. But there was one fixed point, which was the Gili Isles, which are very low-lying islands and which are threatened with extinction by the rising tides. And so this is a political poem too. And that turtles lay their eggs there, and so there's a whole species which depends on them. And I knew they had to be there, and that threat had to be there. But apart from that, I allowed myself, or Ulrika allowed me, the freedom to try and find an English language to bring that back. And that's a working relationship, I think.
Okay. Great. So that's a wonderful note to end on. It seems that we do have to bring this session to a close, according to the message I just received. I think that the possibility of reading it will be there, because we'll be able to see it on the screen. But the challenge of translating something like this and the hands-on experience of working together as a partnership to do that is a wonderful note to end this session on, I think. Session on translation. So I'd like to thank you both very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that I'll continue to be able to read more of your work as it comes out. Thank you so much, Ulrika. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share our verses and thoughts with you.
Thank you, Ulrich, Karen, and Anjum, for that wonderful session. Thank you for sharing your insights into the art and craft of translations. And if you all have enjoyed the session, please do share with your friends and on your social media pages. Thank you all for watching and being such a lovely audience. We promise to be back next week for another exciting session of Words Are Bridges. Good night. Thank you.